Okay, folks, welcome to another lecture and presentation on socialization. So last time we talked about socialization and some basic parts, elements of that idea in sociology and the social sciences. And just as a reminder, socialization we think of as the lifelong social experience by which we develop our human potential and learn culture. So learning culture is a really important part of that, and what we focused on last time was the role of social experience in the development of the self. Okay, so we're going to pick up there, and what we're going to start off looking at is some of the work again of George Herbert Mead in the development of the self. So it's easy to think about the development of the self when you think about young kids, simply because so much happens in such a short period of time. It's very easy to observe, right? So if you have younger brothers and sisters, or if you have children of your own, if you've been old enough, especially if you've had younger brothers and sisters, if you're old enough to have recognized that growth that has occurred, not just physical growth and growing taller and bigger and that sort of thing, but the growth of the self, the development of the self. So much happens in that first year of life. Not only biologically, but usually around the first year of life, or at least if not earlier. Kids can start to talk. They certainly can interact with other humans. They might be able to feed themselves a little bit. And then, as they get a little bit older, start interacting with kids in school settings and that sort of thing. And so Mead, helps us to focus on the key to developing the self is learning to take the role of the other. We talked about taking the role of the other. That doesn't help us just to understand other people, but it also, in the process of understanding them, helps us to understand how we're supposed to be as well. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about imitation, play, and games. And what you see here, let me move my camera out of the way just a tad bit there. What you see here is building on social experience. So in this stage of imitation, if you will, this is when a person is just using their imagination, right? So they're taking their experiences, or maybe they are also dreaming up new possibilities of experiences, right? That's where creativity and fantasy and imagination play such an important role in the human experience, not just for young people, but it helps us to better potentially understand different facets of life, right? So in imitation, we may imitate what it means to fly. If we could fly, we would do this. We would have wings or whatever. And so you're not taking the role of anybody in real life, if you will, or in person. You're imitating something that you think it to be, right? But then we start looking at interactions that people have. And you may have heard the importance of unstructured play with young people, and even the importance of play with other people, learning to get along and to share and to sacrifice. In order for me to be happy, sometimes I need to make sure that people around me are happy. And that's something that's a very subconscious thing that we do, particularly as young people, but still very critical. So this idea about engaging in games, it doesn't just have to be games, any group activity, right? Do you remember the time then that you worked on a group activity with a project with a large group of people maybe, and you realize that the part that you played may seem kind of simple, but that small part you play is important in the grand scheme of getting the project done. You definitely can see this in games, sporting games, if you will, except something like golf, which is very much an individual activity, even though you're competing against other people. But if you think about various sports, soccer, basketball, softball, baseball, any group event activity, cheerleading, dance, theater is a good example, being in a play with other people, you start to realize how important those individual contributions are to accomplish the group goal, right? To kind of put this in context, I like to use soccer as an example, especially soccer with young people. If you've ever seen young people play soccer, I don't know, it depends on how you look at it. It's not all that entertaining in the traditional sense of what we expect soccer to be. And the reason why I say that is because if you watch young kids play soccer, they don't know what they're doing. They're just chasing the ball around the field. You usually don't see the soccer ball because everybody on both teams is right around the ball. And the reason why they do that is at that age, at an early age, children don't understand their role on the team. Think about that as understanding role in society. And that gets us into thinking about recognizing the generalized other. I may not know everybody on the team. I may not know everybody in society. But I understand that other people are doing their part for the good of everybody, not just themselves, but for me as well. I contribute to society, but other people do too. I may not know them. And that really starts to tap into the social inclinations of humans. Right? We really take that for granted. Sometimes it's not front and center in our thinking because in our society, and I think this is a cultural thing as well, but in the United States we have a tendency to really value the individual more so than the group. It depends on the context. If we're in sport event or if part of us being successful depends upon the group being successful, we have a tendency to value that a little bit more, the people that are part of that group. Let's come back to engaging about soccer again, right? So the value of games, generally speaking, and using soccer as an example, is it helps us to learn rules and regulations and to learn norms as well. You might remember in our discussions on culture, the importance of rules and regulations in society. Well, by participating in group activities, you start to learn that not only there are expectations for you by other people, and if you don't adhere to those expectations, you might not be part of the game. We'll get to that a little bit more in a second. But in some cases, if you violate the rules of the game, then you're going to get kicked out. If you violate the rules of society, society reserves the right to remove you. Right? So, Mead, part of his work, a good chunk of his work on symbolic interactions and focuses on this. Now, again, socialization and the development of the self doesn't end once you are a certain age. So you can think about this in different aspects of life, even how older adults go through this idea of imitation or recognizing the generalized other and how that process helps us to better develop ourselves, right? Okay. Moving on to the next item here. The Looking Glass Self. Charles Horton Cooley and the Looking Glass Self. Let me adjust my camera again just a little bit there for you. So this is a quote, and I want to be sure that I tell you that. This is a quote by Charles Horton Cooley. This is not something that I said. I want you to be clear about that because this quote is a little bit deep, okay? It's focused on the idea of a looking glass self. Kind of like when I look in the mirror, but with somebody else, do I see what I expect to see, and do they see what I want them to see? Okay? So let's read this definition. Cooley says, society is an interweaving and interworking of mental selves. I imagine your mind, remember I told you we're going to be talking about mind in a moment. This is not brain, this is the mind. Okay? And so we're talking about the development of the self. Okay? So beyond the biology. But I imagine your mind, and especially what your mind thinks about my mind, and what your mind thinks about what my mind thinks about your mind. Okay, that's a little bit deep. What he's talking about here is social experience, but also the subconscious of social experience. So over time, remember, symbolic interactionism is that sees society as the product of our everyday interactions with other people and experiences, right? So as I have experiences over time, it enables me to better understand and relate to people because I have in my mind an understanding as to how I'm supposed to interact. Now, this is all based on social experience too. For people that isolate themselves, they don't get along very well in society. There's sometimes some difficulty there at least, right? Going a little bit further, it says, I dress my mind before yours and expect that you will dress yours before mine. So whoever cannot or will not perform these feats is not properly in the game. Okay. So he's not talking necessarily about fashion here. What does he mean by dressing your mind? So as a student, how do you dress your mind as a student? And what we're getting at here is, do you do the kinds of things that you're supposed to do to be a student? How do I dress my mind as a teacher? And that actually might include what I wear. You know, do I meet the expectations that you have of me? Do I meet the expectations that you have for me? Remember the self? He goes on to say, whoever cannot or will not perform these feats, regardless as to the reason as to why, but if you cannot perform these feats, you're not properly in the game. So I run the risk of you not paying attention to me if I don't do the kinds of things that teachers are supposed to do. You run the risk of maybe not doing well in the class if you don't do what you're supposed to do as a student. Well, how do you know what you're supposed to do? That goes back to culture. What are the rules and regulations? What are the guidelines? What are the norms? What are the expectations? Okay. And, you know, thankfully for college students, most of them, right, they've had a lot of experience with school, and so they kind of have an idea about what it means to be a student. Sometimes I find with older students that have been out of school for a little while, and some of you might be able to relate to this, they sometimes struggle when they first come back because school now is different than school was when they were last in school. Socialization, right? That process of developing our human potential and learning culture. A big part of developing yourself and your human potential is knowing what the norms are and the expectations and how to navigate that. It's a big part of it, right? Cooley, that's an interesting comment. Interesting look at that, right? So have you ever seen young children put on their parents' shoes, literally putting themselves in the shoes of another person, right? Or playing dress up. That's imitation. How does this help children learn to take the role of the other? Okay, you assume what it's like to be that person, and you start imagining and breathing life into that character. We sometimes like to do this on Halloween, putting on a costume and becoming the costume, becoming a different person. That's one of the things that's fun about Halloween, right? Okay, agents of socialization. So I'm going to stop right there, and we're going to end on that note for this this session here. And thank you for your time and attention. And I'll be back soon.